Thank you so much, everybody. I apologize.
Thanks,
Oh,
Megan.
we're also going to be asking for people to fill out a questionnaire, right? Prior. So while Megan is talking, if you could put the questionnaire up, it'll just be a few things to give information. Oh, never mind. I lied. There's no polls for this one. My apologies. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just working on, I think there we go. So I'm certified in early intervention all the way up through age 20. And that is something that has changed a lot, especially in Pennsylvania, as far as what people can be certified in special education. My previous teaching experience, I taught in the school district of Philadelphia for several years and served as a special education liaison for my school, where I taught 4th and 5th grades. And then I transferred over to KIPP Philadelphia Charter Schools, where I spent several more years. And I was the inclusion lead teacher in the 6th grade. So what that meant is I was technically the regular education teacher, and I had a co-teacher who was the special education teacher. But because I was certified in special education as well, that meant anytime that I sat down with our kids and I was implementing IEP hours. And so between the two of us, we were really able to push our kids along. And I add in here, not as like a type of brag, although I am proud of it, but as like, this is possible. Our average growth for our kids in reading, because we did inclusion with everything except math, that was a separate class. For our kids' reading growth in 1 year grew 2.5 years on average. And that was all of our kids. And over half of our kids had IEPs or 504 plans. And we worked really hard to make sure that all of our kids attained their goals. So when Vanita reached out to me through this training, I was like, yes, I'm very passionate about this. I feel very strongly because I know it works. Back when I had my daughter in 2018, I went back to school to receive my master's, and I was really intrigued with applied behavior analysis, or ABA. So I received my master's in special education with a concentration in ABA and began working as an RBT right before COVID hit. So not the best timing, but it's been something that I really love doing. And I'm really interested in learning everything about ABA. And so now I'm excited to be in a position where I can share that with everyone. So that's a little bit about me. Today, we're going to be covering 3 main buckets of ideas. So SMART goals, what are they? Some examples, questions you as parents can ask in meetings. Data, all the different types of data collection. You do not have to be a professional in listing every type of data collection, but this is something to give you a big overview of what's possible. Data can be collected in a lot of different ways, and it's important that the correct way is chosen so we are collecting adequate data for our kids. And the third bucket is measuring mastery. Because we have these goals, we want to make sure our kids are mastering them and they're taking them out of the classroom, out of the home, into the community, and they are able to access them in all spaces. So those are the 3 main buckets we're going to talk about today. So the first one is SMART goals. And SMART goals is an acronym for 5 different areas within goal writing. So the first one is to be specific, and I'll break these all down. The next one is goals should be measurable. They should be achievable. They should be results oriented and time bound. And some of those terms get switched up a little bit, but they all pretty much represent the same thing. So the first thing is that goals should be specific. So we need to know exactly what our kids should be learning. And the first thing you want to look for as the adult representing this kid in the IEP meeting is vague wording. We don't want any vague wording. Try, should, kids are encouraged to do something. We need specific language, what our kids will be doing. As a good rule of thumb, you want to ask yourself, if a new teacher from a whole different school who didn't know anything about this classroom or this kid reads this IEP and is responsible for implementing it, will they know exactly what needs to be taught? That is how specific it should be. Not, our child should get better at reading. What does that mean? We need to be very specific. And so across the next few lines, I have the same goal example at the bottom of the page, and I color coded where you can see each part of the SMART goal in it. So for the specific aspect is, I'll read the whole goal and then we'll go over it. By May 20th, 2023, Grace will be able to independently orally read a novel or new text passage at the second grade reading level at 148 words per minute, as measured by curriculum-based measurement across 3 probes. And we've included the baseline in there because it's really important to know the starting point for our kids. And so currently, Grace is independently reading at a K.9 reading level and reads 18 correct words per minute. The specific part of that goal is independently orally read a novel text passage. Any teacher who comes in to that goal and reads it knows that not only should this child be reading, but Grace needs to read it independently. That means without mistakes. Grace should be reading it orally, and it should be novel or a new text passage. That's how we know that Grace has mastered that part of this skill. So that's how specific it should be.
So when we say novel, that means new material, nothing that she's ever been exposed to before, because it would be silly to say, Grace, read this 5 times silently, right? And then we're going to have you read it orally, and I'm going to see where you get how many correct words per minute. Novel means just that, novel.
Right, because if Grace is truly independent in reading, she should be able to pick up a text at a second grade reading level and read it independently, no matter if she's seen it before or not. So that is the specific part of it. Oops, there we go. All right, the next part, measurable. So these goals should be observable. We should be able to track them. And this is where the data tracking section will also come into play. And they should be able to be seen, and data should be tracked, and it should be measured. And measurement can be based on type of standardized testing. It can be based on curriculum-based measurements, work samples with a rubric. And it should also include any conditions under which the student is performing this work. So the goal is written to independence, but working towards that goal, if there are conditions such as certain prompts that need to be used to get to independence, that should be written in the subpart of the goal. Will the material be novel? Will it be new? So all of these things need to be considered when this goal is measured. And so the measurable part of this goal that will be able to be seen is, will Grace be reading at 148 words per minute as measured by curriculum-based measurement across 3 probes? So that means Grace is doing this not 80% of the time, but across 3 trials is Grace achieving this goal. That shows, and that's much easier to see than if you say 80% or 90%. That is much easier to see. Yes, Grace has done this 3 times in a row.
So someone asked, what are probes?
So probes or trials are sometimes used interchangeably. And so that means that there are 3 chances that we are giving Grace to demonstrate that she has read this text. So sometimes you might see probes, sometimes you might see trials or attempts written in a goal.
Thanks.
The next part is attainable. So here is where you might hear some debate in the special education community, because what you'll see oftentimes in a lot of goals, and what we're taught as future educators, is shoot for 80%, because nobody's perfect. Shoot for 80%. And you might hear a lot of debate between professionals in the area about, well, should it be 80% or 100%? Because shouldn't the goal be that somebody can do something 100% of the time? Sure, we all make mistakes, but if you try to do something 3 times in a row, can you do it at 100% each time? And a good way to think about this is, if a goal for a child is to look both ways before crossing the street, you don't want to say that that child can do that 80% of the time and they're independent. Because I don't know about you, but I do not want my daughter only looking before she crosses the street 80% of the time. I want her looking 100% of the time both ways before she crosses the street. And so there are ways that we can write goals to independence while still understanding that nobody's perfect. And so including that across 3 probes or across 3 trials is a really good way to show that you can do something to pretty much independence, because if a mistake is made, then you start the probes again, you try them again. So be a little wary and don't be afraid to push back if you see goals that are written to 80%, because really you want your child to be able to do this nearly 100% of the time, especially if it's something that is built, other skills are built on top of it. You want your child to be able to recognize the letters of the alphabet 100% of the time. Letter recognition is important, and if your child cannot recognize those letters, then if somebody is writing a goal for phonemic awareness but your child's having difficulty understanding letters, then that's not something that can be used. So to make something attainable, it needs to be reachable for your child, absolutely, and it needs to be based on the present levels of performance. So we're not going to have a child who is working on letter recognition work on independently orally reading at a 2nd grade reading level. That is not attainable. So it needs to be based on the present levels of performance. And it's okay if it's challenging. It's okay. It should be. And really don't be afraid to push for that independence. It's okay if a kid needs a push. And so for Grace, her attainable goal is reading at a 2nd grade reading level. Looking at her current reading level, in 1 year, we should be able to get Grace to that goal. It wouldn't be attainable to want Grace to be at a 5th grade reading level if she's at K.9, but a 2nd grade reading level by the end of the year is attainable.
So for students with IEPs, if your specific learning disability also is dyslexic, the obligation for the LEA is to close that gap, right? 1 year's progress in 1 year's time. For all other children, you have to kind of look at that rate of acquisition as well. When we talk about data, if a teacher prompts a child, keep in mind that that data point is based upon the teacher and what they did, and not necessarily what your child did. So we always want to make sure that we're collecting data on independent responses, being that of the child, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Yeah, don't be afraid to push for that. I think that's really important, because that is a big dialogue within the special education community for the professionals who are responsible for implementing IEPs, because teachers get nervous. Well, if we're saying 100%, nobody's perfect. That's not what we're saying has to happen. But if we are reaching true mastery, true independence, this should be a skill that is very reliably able to be done by that child without help. That is the goal.
Yeah, some goals should be 100%. For example, if I have behavioral goals because I have a child who is, say, property disruption and tearing up a classroom, I definitely want that to be 100%, right? Where they're not doing that, right? Usually reading comprehension is 90%, not 80%. And then you have to look at the prerequisite skills. If I'm learning my letters, right? I'm learning just to identify my letters and I only do that at 80%. How is that going to impact reading? Right. So all of that kind of plays.
Right. Exactly. Especially these foundational skills. Those are the ones that you need to not be afraid to push for sure, because they're really critical for future skills. Absolutely. And I included in here too something for prompt hierarchy, because you might see some goals that include prompts or steps to get to independence. Kids are going to need some help. And so that comes in the form of different prompts. And there is a hierarchy of the most intensive prompt, which is a full physical. That means you are doing hand over hand for that child, all the way down to just giving a partial verbal reminder that's maybe starting the word, giving them that little hint. And all of that is to be used to get to independence. So it's okay with working towards independence. A prompt hierarchy can be used. You might hear in the field of ABA somebody saying errorless learning, which means we want to help the child if they make a mistake. We want to jump in and teach them the right way to do it so they don't learn the wrong way to do it. And that's where prompts and prompts hierarchy are very important. That being said, it's really important to watch out for something called prompt dependency. And that is when a child becomes dependent on receiving that prompt in order to complete the task. And so that is what we want to avoid. And so a BCBA should be the one to train the staff and whoever is implementing the IEP on how to use the prompt hierarchy to avoid that. Because our goal is always to work towards the least amount of prompting possible. Because if a child is completing something with you putting your hand on their hand, they're not doing it at independence. And then if a child becomes reliant on doing that with your hand over them, they are not working towards independence. So a child may be able to complete a skill, but prompt dependency means that they are relying on help to complete it, even if they know how to complete it.
So you might read through your report and say, you know, Johnny can Johnny can recognize the letters of the alphabet with verbal prompts, right? That's going to cue you in that Johnny cannot do it without
Right.
verbal prompts. Prompting is dangerous. Prompt dependency can be very dangerous. You need to know how to fade that properly. That's why in ABA, most of your providers do most to least, right? Because when you do least to most, you can do what's called embedding errors. And I'll let you explain that, Megan.
Yeah. So when I said error correction, an example will be if you ask a child to imitate waving. You say, do this, and you wave, and they immediately clap. You don't want to do the least prompt, which would be, oh no, clapping is doing this. You want to go in and hand over hand and clap for them, and then give that demand, do this, and then immediately hand over hand clap for them. So that way they don't learn how to do it incorrectly. And then from that, the next time I probe that or give a trial of that, I'll say, do this. And instead of putting both hands on their hands, I will use their elbow. And I'll say, do this, and give what's called a partial physical. So they are doing the clapping, but I'm helping by pushing the elbow. And so somebody like an RBT or a BCABA or a BCBA, somebody who is trained in this will know that prompt hierarchy. They know it is drilled in you to start from most to least. So our kids don't learn the wrong way to do something. We want to give them as few opportunities to do it incorrectly as possible. So that's where you want to make sure you're starting from most to least with the prompts.
That's why we call it errorless teaching, because we know that you probably don't know what we're asking you to do, right? And we give you the answer so that this way you learn it. Because if I turn around and say, what's this? And you don't know what it is, and you take a guess, I've already embedded an error. And I don't want to do that. I don't want you guessing at something.
Yeah, exactly. So the R part of SMART goals is realistic and relevant. So they should be relevant to your child's needs, and they need to be realistic in what they're going to be able to obtain. And so for Grace, looking at her current level, which independently reading is K.9, moving her up to second grade reading level by the end of the year is realistic for her. And it is relevant for her because the ability to read independently is something she is going to need to be able to do. And so, especially when going into IEP meetings, looking at goals that are going to benefit your child in areas of academics, communication, social skills, functional skills, or vocational skills, these goals should work towards where they are going to be and what's going to give them the best quality of life possible. And so these should be things that are relevant to their life and going to be relevant as they move forward, especially behavioral goals. Being able to be in a situation without eloping or leaving the room is something that is very relevant to most kids. And so you want to be able to show that these goals are going to work towards something in their life moving forward. The other thing I included in here is, I'm not trying to be like a negative Nancy towards people in my field, but goals, IEP goals should never be copied and pasted from one child's IEP to another. And I can sympathize and empathize with teachers being pulled in 1,000 directions and tired and overworked and all of that. That being said, an IEP is an individualized education plan. They should never look or feel like they are just standard and they've been put in everyone's IEP, because sometimes, unfortunately, that is something that happens. There are so many goals, the IEPs are a lot of paperwork to keep up with. Oh, this kid has something similar to this kid. I'm just going to take this goal and copy and paste it. This needs to be relevant to your child and your child alone.
So to hop on that, some LEAs or MALs will write goals that say, given verbal and visual prompts elicited to the lowest level, the child will. We don't want to write goals like that, because that means if your child can be prompted through something, say they're supposed to master following directions, and there are 10 of them, right? Well, if they're prompted to follow through on 10 directions, that means they've mastered the goal, because we've built prompts into the goal, right? Prompts should be in your specially designed instruction. That's what we use to teach the annual goal. The other point that I wanted to make was, and I can't remember what that was. There were two things I wanted to say. When you have a math goal, Megan, right? They'll be like, they're at 3 points and we want to get them up to 14 points, right? And that's based upon your curriculum-based measure. You want to make sure that you understand what that means. So they can write the overarching goal like that, the annual goal, but you want them to write short-term objectives, right? So that you know exactly what it is that they're going to master in 1 year's time, because you want to know what they're working on.
Right. An IEP should include, in this many months, this is what the child should be able to do to demonstrate they're getting towards independence. We want to see road signs, mile markers, to show that we're getting to the destination. That's what I always thought of those as, mile markers, because if you're missing that mile marker, you're not going to make it to that final destination. So it's imperative to check in throughout that year, since most IEP goals are written for the end of the school year. It's imperative throughout the school year to check in to make sure, with that measurable aspect of the goal, are we making it to that end part? And if not, what evidence-based interventions are we using to get to that point? So those are really important. That's a good point, Benita. Thank you. And the last part of SMART goal is timely. And so we just talked about, most IEP goals are written a year in advance. So you'll see most dates being in by May or June, close to when the end of the school year is going to be. But progress monitoring should occur at regular intervals, and not really every few months. For the sake of the IEP, yes, we need to check in, but whoever is implementing the IEP should be checking in very frequently. And especially for things that require more intensive services and a lot of behavior goals, some of those need continuous data to show, not just every few months. We want to make sure that our kids are progressing at a rate that shows that they are making those improvements in the areas that we want them to. So yes, IEP goals most of the time are written for a year in advance, but we really need to make sure that those mile markers are in there and that this is being checked frequently.
And one little piece, going back to that goal, if the goal says that they're going to master at 148 words per minute and the baseline is 18, you want to make sure that your progress report doesn't have percentages down, right? You want your progress report to match your annual goal, which means if she's currently at 18 correct words per minute and the goal is 148 correct words per minute, where is she in the first quarter? Hopefully she's beyond 18, right? So maybe she's at 45 or 50 correct words per minute. That's what the information you want to know.
Yes. Yeah, those mile markers, those progress monitoring should also be specific. We need to see exactly what that progress is, not that there's just some improvement. We want to make sure we're on the right path for sure. And so I included some examples of SMART goals and some non-examples, right? So we said avoid words like improve. We're not improving. We need to know exactly where, in this case, Adam is going to be in his independence in reading. And so we also italicize here independent and novel, because we're working to independence. That's what the goal is. And exactly like Benita said earlier, these tasks should be tested and measured with novel things, not something that has been seen previously or vocabulary words that have been studied over months. We want to know that our kids have the skills to open a new book and be able to read it, not because they practice it, but because they're reading it independently. And so this example of a reading goal is very similar to Grace's example in all of the other slides. And so I'm going to bump forward to written expression. I just want to say a couple of things about written expression. Similar to reading, the prompts that we're giving kids, and when I say prompt, I don't mean physical prompt or verbal prompt. For written expression, I'm meaning the prompts that we are giving them, the assignment for writing. So if for narrative writing, it is, what is your dream job and why? That should be a prompt. That is a prompt. And that should be a prompt that child has not seen or practiced before. So if that child has practiced writing that piece 5 times, and then you give them that prompt again, and that's your measurement for independence, that's not independence. So whatever we're measuring with should be a novel prompt, just like for Grace's example, the text that Grace was reading was novel. It was new. She hadn't seen it before. Same thing for written expression. This should not be a piece of writing that your child has practiced over and over again. The other thing is that the goal should include how many pieces a student is writing per quarter, per trimester. That's that mile marker. For writing, it's a bit different. So you want to see how many pieces are they writing each section of the year, and then how is it being scored? So if it's one teacher scoring all of them, that's a bit more opinion based. If you have multiple teachers scoring them each time based on a rubric, such as the PSSA rubric, which I included a link for in here, then that is based on something that's curriculum based, and that is multiple people are scoring it. So it's not just one person scoring it each time. And that gives you a bit more information as far as measurement goes. For vocabulary, being specific about vocabulary is really important, especially with not just will a student be able to identify words. We want our kids to have the skills to identify new words, not just memorize what a set of words means. So for this goal, it's not just that Julie will be able to explain a class vocabulary word in 8 out of 10 trials. It's that Julie will be able to independently and correctly identify a synonym and antonym for curriculum-based class vocabulary word when presented with 20 novel vocabulary word flashcards. So these are not words that Julie has practiced before, but the skill of identifying synonyms and antonyms for these words that she's been practicing, because they're based on curriculum-based words, is something that she can achieve independently. And then for math, in the non-example, there's with the aid of a calculator. And so that is a prompt similar to like a physical prompt or something like that. And so are we having our child rely on a calculator, or are we having them being able to independently solve these problems? Now, we're right now in this example talking about addition and subtraction with numbers from 0 to 10 and 11 to 20. We're not talking about trigonometry and all of these things that you need graphing calculators for. But to show independence, Emma needs to be able to independently solve these problems. So not can Emma plug them into a calculator, but for relevance in Emma's life, can she solve addition and subtraction problems used from numbers 0 to 10 and 11 to 20? And can she do it in under 3 seconds? Because similar to words per minute in reading, in math, fluency is the time it takes you to complete these problems. So was Emma sitting in front of this problem for 5 minutes, or is she able to solve it in 3 seconds? Because if it's taking her 5 minutes, she's not doing it independently at that point. So it's really important with math to look at fluency, similar to reading, but fluency in math is how quickly our children are solving these problems. And I also included in here a slide, and like Benita said, this is just a resource for you. It's not going to read through each one of these, but these are good questions to have on hand next time you go in an IEP meeting, to ask yourself and to ask the service providers in the room these questions around the goals. Do they understand what's being taught? Are they based on the present level of performance? And how do you know that? What's the data? What's the information? How is all this data going to be taken? That's that measurement part. We need to know how often these results are going to be analyzed for progress. What are the mile markers? What's the data that's going to be taken at each mile marker? What are the goals for each one? How are we going to know we're on the right path? And so this is just a good resource to take with you to these meetings, to ask yourself, but to also ask all of these service providers as well. I hope I'm not going too fast, but I know this PowerPoint will be presented. We good, Benita? Good. Great. I also included, these are all links. So when you have this PowerPoint, you can go in each one of these resources for SMART goals. And then at the bottom, I included the site Reading Rockets, which I know Benita was telling me more about. And it's a really great resource for determining reading levels, appropriate words per minute, knowing that people can just kind of pull numbers, but what's it based off of? We want to make sure that our kids are reading at the appropriate levels. And What Works Clearinghouse is a really great resource for evidence-based practices. And that's another thing when you go into these IEP meetings, what are the evidence-based practices that we're using? Are we just, as we kind of like to say in this world, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks? Or ethically, which if anyone's in the world of ABA, it is part of our ethics that every single thing that we do needs to be evidence-based. We cannot just be trying things out to see what works, because that's not ethical. And so this website is a really great resource for all different areas, and it's not just reading. Okay. Benita, should we move on to data collection, or were there any relevant questions that? Okay, cool.
I'm trying to throw stuff into the chat for anybody who might be wondering. I'm just
perfect.
A little bit more background information.
Great.
But feel free to ask questions as well.
Yes. Moving on to data collection. Before I even go into this, there's a lot of information. I'm going to tell you, people that go to school for ABA specifically in training, we literally spend hours, weeks, months, practice, supervision hours learning all of these data collection methods. So this is a lot of information, and this is not for you to become a professional in data collection, because I'm trying to become a professional in data collection and it's really hard. So I am just trying to put some of the most important ways to look at data collection with some examples. And I do have video links. I won't have time to show them all, but I'll throw them into the chat when I'm done. They're not the best videos, and that they're not super engaging, but they give a really good, just clear example of how some of these different types of data can be collected. So don't look at it for video quality or Emmy performances, but they are helpful in kind of looking at the different examples. So when I look at different data types of collections, this is where my head kind of goes in organizing it, because it's a lot of information. So I think about observation-based data. Now, these are all based on things that can be seen. So they're all kind of observation-based in a way, but you'll see what I mean by anecdotal data and ABC data is more based on the watching and observing, and trial-based is on how many trials and probes are we giving our kids. And there's two types. There's continuous and there's discontinuous. And so I'll get into those, but I like to put this in here because this is how I have to kind of organize it in my head. So maybe somebody will find this helpful as well. So the first type of observational data is anecdotal data. And so this is where, and this is why I think of it as observational, because that's what it is. It is when somebody is watching what is happening and you're just taking notes on things that are taking place. So it's not specifically to look at one predetermined behavior, like we're only looking for every time a student yells out. This is just looking at a complete description, what's happening in a setting, in a classroom, in the home, and everything. And I think the hardest part is keeping it objective and not subjective. And so the next slide I have includes different ways to keep this as objective as possible. And instead of using feeling words, using anything that you can see, it has to be able to be seen. And so anecdotal data is often used in a lot of FBAs. It's helpful for analysis of behavior, but not so much evaluating it or trying to come to a conclusion about the behavior. You're just really looking at what's happening in the whole picture. It's often used in a lot of assessments or observations. If you've had like a BCBA come to your house, you've probably had them say, I'm going to take some anecdotal data or I'm going to take some observational data and just kind of record everything that's happening. And so that's where that comes in. Now, getting more specific in this type of data. Oh, sorry, before I go ahead. These are some tips on how to keep data objective. And so as a caregiver, especially if you want to take anecdotal data of things that are happening, I know for me watching my child, I make a lot of assumptions as to why she does certain things. But if I really want to sit down and take anecdotal data of what's happening, I need to kind of take myself out of that and not include feeling words or opinions of why I think she's doing something, just writing down exactly what's happening as I see it in plain black and white language, including numbers of how often things happen, what happened before and after. We're not using a lot of adjectives like very or angry or any of those things. Just what do you actually see? Child yelled out, and that's it. Versus child screamed extremely loud. We're keeping it as objective as possible. Getting a little bit more specific is ABC data. Now, this is the type of data that is specifically used to determine what we say the function or the reason behind the behavior. What is causing that behavior? And sometimes you'll hear, well, we just take ABC data in the beginning to describe the function, and then that's it. And some places in the world of ABA teach you that that's the only time you use ABC data. But I will tell you, as somebody who's in the field, taking continuous ABC data on specific behaviors that you really want to decrease is really important, because it also holds me accountable as the service provider. Am I playing a role in these behaviors? Am I responding correctly to these behaviors? So with ABC data, you're recording what happens right before the behavior and what happens right after the behavior immediately. Now, if you want to get more anecdotal in your anecdotal notes and describe the whole situation, that's one thing. But an ABC data is a snapshot of before and right after. Oftentimes, you'll see people use checklists because when you're running a session, it is a bit easier to kind of check off if you have a set of similar antecedents or what happens before and similar consequences, things that happen after. It can be easy to do that, or you can just use a simple 3-column chart to jot all of this down. But this is something, especially as a caregiver for your kid, to have the service team use to make sure that they are responding appropriately to these behaviors. This is a really important tool. And so this is an example of a checklist that people might use. And again, these are things that can and should be individualized to your child. These are the behaviors specifically you're working on with your child. These are the things that have been determined to be repeated antecedents, because some behaviors have more than one function. And so there will be multiple antecedents and they need to be responded to differently. If a behavior occurs because a child, the function is attention, then you want the consequences to be similar to that, right? Either provided attention or ignored the behavior. And so having something that is specific to your child and to those behaviors is really important. So these are often used, or just a simple chart being very specific. I've worked with places that have some ABC charts that are very vague and some that are very specific. I always include the time. And if you're looking at how long a behavior occurs, like a tantrum behavior, and you want to decrease the time that a child is technically in a tantrum, then you need to know how long that tantrum lasted. And so having that information in here is very helpful as well. So those are the two types of observational data where we're kind of recording writing out what has happened. The next type of data is we're looking at counts, we're looking at amount of time, and we're looking at how much we're measuring that as far as over how much time as well. So this is continuous data, which means this is data that we're taking constantly, not just for like one chunk of time. And so the first type of data is cold probe data. And this is also something that shows you where a child is at with mastering a skill. And so when I'm doing something, you might hear or you might know about tabletop or discrete trial training, when you're sitting down with a child, usually at a table, and you have your list of skills that you're working on, and you're checking off how many times a child got an answer correct with independence, or they required prompting, so they did not get it independently. Cold probe data is something that's extremely helpful to whoever's providing that service to help decide what are we working on that day. And so cold probe means you're going in and asking them for the first time to complete that task. So if you're looking for something like motor imitation, going back to the clapping example, your cold probe would just be, hey, Benita, do this. Good job. And so I would check that off. So that's the cold probe. I did not provide any prompts. I'm just checking to see if Benita can do that. And so that is something that shows you, as a service provider going in, something you should work on. It doesn't mean just because Benita got it correctly, I'm not going to come back to it at all, but it might show me how much repetition I need to provide with that skill, especially if you have a child that really needs a lot of repetition for something. You don't want to spend all of your time doing repetition for something that they have pretty much at independence. You want to spend your time on repetition with things that they really aren't at independence with yet. And so frequency data. Frequency data you might hear as tally mark data or count data. That is simply how many times in a probe or trial that a child responded correctly or independently to a demand. And this is also where you'll see it oftentimes with discrete child training as well, or tabletop. And in the world of ABA, we use like a term called fixed or a fixed ratio. And so this means how many demands are we placing on a child before we give the reinforcer. So am I asking Mary to identify one letter correctly and then she gets her reinforcer of watching a video? Or can I probe 3 times and then I provide that reinforcement? And that's something that's worked on with the BCBA through gathering all of the baseline data and the present level of performance, how many times you're going to provide something. And that doesn't always have to stay that way. You can also use variable ratios so it changes, but that is something that's individualized for your child as well. And you can use this when behaviors have a clear beginning and an end. And that being said, it doesn't show you how many times a behavior occurs in a set of time. It's just the time part is variable. And so frequency data can be helpful for things where the time part might not be as relevant, but, and this is how you would track it, tally marks. Rate is when you take frequency over time. So how many times did that child demonstrate or show that behavior over a set of time? And that's where you get much more accurate data, especially for things within behavior goals. How many times did a child yell out in one session is different for a 5-hour session versus 1 hour. So if you can say, oh, the child yelled out 5 times today, but is that over 5 hours or is that over 20 minutes? That's very different. And so for behaviors that you want to get a really clear picture on, especially behaviors that you might be trying to decrease, you want to know the rate at which it's happening. And I will just say, like, being in this field, people confuse frequency, including RBTs and teachers. People confuse frequency and rate all the time. Frequency is just the count. Rate is the count over time. So it's usually expressed as a fraction or a percentage. And that's where you're going to get a much clearer picture. of that. And if you're looking at just 3 behaviors, a chart like this would work. For kids that I work with, this would not work because we're looking at a lot of different behaviors. So my paper is double-sided, it has all different marks. So, but you can use a simple paper to track all of these. Or you can break down chunks of time during the day for one behavior and track how many times it happens in each section of time. Duration data is pretty much what it sounds like. It's how long does a behavior last? So how long it lasts from beginning to end. And this requires a timer or stopwatch. You cannot take accurate duration data by guessing or counting in your head or watching a clock. Nobody can do that. To get accurate data, you need a timer or stopwatch, and most professionals have one of these. So you can use that to get accurate read on duration. And so you might want to use duration data with high rate behaviors that you can clearly see the beginning and you can clearly see the end of. So tantrums, screaming, sustained attention. So with some kids I work with, we're working on sustaining attention to a toy or a task. And so I must, since where like my Apple Watch comes into play, I can start a timer right away. And so that way I know the whole amount of time, the duration that child has spent playing with that toy independently or with another person. This is also good for behaviors that last for inconsistent periods of time. And it can be used both for behaviors you want to increase, like sustained attention, or behaviors you want to decrease, like tantrums or screaming or out of their seat. And a simple paper like this works. A lot of behavioral companies especially will have apps that you can actually start timers and stop them as well, but they can be kind of a pain. So sticking with the good old timer and stopwatch is really helpful. And then it can be something specific like this that you jot out the start and end time, and then you can total them out at the end. Now, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So continuous data is collected over whole periods of time, and you're counting every time that behavior occurred in that period of time. Discontinuous data, we're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of ABA, is where we're only recording data in chunks. And we might only record it if it happens once, or we only record it if it happens at the end. And you might ask yourself, like, why would you want to do that? But for some teachers that have larger classrooms and for caretakers at home who you might want to collect data yourself, but you have other kids and you're working and all of this, discontinuous data can be helpful. And I do, at the end of this, have a chart in here that's really helpful that lists out the pros and cons of using all of these, which is very helpful for me too, looking at. So with all of these, when we talk about intervals, we're talking about chunks of time. And this is where a BCBA would determine how much time we're looking at. Are we looking at an interval of 30 seconds? Are we looking at an interval of 1 minute, 5 minutes? It depends on the child and their goals. And so whole interval data means we break the session down into equal parts or intervals. And for this, we're only recording if the behavior occurred during the entire interval. So talking about using a stopper and a timer, you need this for discontinuous. You have to have some type of thing that's going to show you that you're in a specific interval. So this typically underestimates the occurrence of the behavior because it can be rare sometimes for kids to demonstrate a behavior the entire interval. But this can be helpful for behaviors that occur over long periods of time, and where doing duration might be impractical because it's just occurring for a long period of time. This is specifically good for behaviors that you want to increase. So the amount of time spent engaged in table work, the amount of time spent on functional play. So you can use whole interval data for that. This is not something that you'd use for like a kid who has like short yells. in a class, because if they don't last very long, then you would only have intervals of a few seconds, and that wouldn't make sense. So these are for behaviors that you might want to increase. And this would be an example of how you can do that. So with any of this discontinuous data, you clearly can see where the intervals are. There are these blocks of time, and you can use checks, plus, minus, yes, no, to see. But this does require a lot of observation, because you have to see if it occurred the entire time that that interval happened. So this would not be good for a teacher who has 20, 25 kids in the classroom, because that teacher can't look that whole time to see that whole interval data, that whole interval happened. And here's another example, looks very similar. So partial interval data. Again, we're breaking the session down into equal parts, and we record if the behavior occurred at any point during the interval. So if it occurred at all, we're checking it down. It does not have to occur throughout the entire time. It does not. It can happen once. That being said, it often overestimates the occurrence of behavior, because you're just checking if it happened at all. And so you need to use the smallest interval that's practical for that child. So these would be good or ideal for behaviors that don't have a clear start and end point, and that they occur at such a high rate that you might not be able to account for each occurrence. So some self-stimulating behaviors that you might want to decrease, if it happens at such a high rate that it doesn't make sense to track every single time it happened, partial interval would work with that. So it's much better for behaviors that you want to decrease that occur at a really high rate and very frequently, that it actually becomes difficult to count every single time it happened. And it's also good for staff that might not be able to count every time it happened, especially teachers or somebody that works with multiple kids. And so similar, you can check yes, no. This specifically lists out the behaviors. These are good for behaviors that you want to decrease. And so did it happen, yes or no at all? And the intervals can be as long as 15 minutes, or they can be as short as 30 seconds. So momentary time sampling is a little bit different. You still are breaking the session down into intervals, but you just check it off if it happens at the end. And so it's just a quick snapshot of whether or not a behavior occurred. And so this can be used when other data collection methods are just kind of impractical, and they don't make a lot of sense, and they're not going to give you a clear snapshot of what's going on, or the person who's recording the data is unable to continually monitor the situation. It can be used for behaviors such as working independently or playing alone at home. Those are good behaviors to use this for. So again, these are not like data collection methods that you need to become professionals on, but just knowing this language and knowing some of the difference between some of them can be very helpful, because going back to the SMART goals, when we're talking about measurement and what data is going to be used, we have to use the data that's going to help us achieve that goal for that child. And so again, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but there's pros and cons for using all of these different type of data methods. And so knowing whether your child has a goal of something they want to increase or something they want to decrease, who is taking the data, what is realistic for that data, because if we're not getting accurate data, there's no point in collecting it. So taking all of those things into play will help understand what type of data should we really be taking here. What is the goal, and what data method can help us get there? And so there's a lot of information with this. I rely on this graphic a lot with helping me understand these data collection methods. Like I said, I'm trying to become a professional here, and this is really hard. So this is, I think, a really helpful chart to reference as well. And again, these are just some data collection resources, and I will drop the links for the videos at the end. And I'm going to hop into our last section, which isn't as long, but is very important, which is mastery and how we're going to measure for that. So when we think of mastery, we need to know the present level of academic achievement for your child to identify what the needs are. After those needs are identified is when you get that baseline assessment. So what's the starting point that we're working on? You have to know baseline before you can make the goal, because in order to make it attainable and relevant. Then you make your IEP goals, and then we're kind of in a cycle of teaching, continued assessment, teaching, checking the goal. Are we on track? Continuous teaching, taking more data, going back. It is a cycle that should be going around over and over again in that process to get to mastery. That is the goal. And so mastery, we've talked about this with the goals as well, is that we need to know if a child has mastered a concept, because all of these skills build on each other. We need to know that kids have the skills that they need to get to that next step and where they need to go. Skills are also often taught out of context, especially in classroom settings or treatment centers. So to know if a skill is mastered, it needs to be generalized to the natural environment. And so an example of that is if a child learns how to read crossing signals at a light in a classroom, they've learned the pictures. Does that mean, but if they go out onto the street and they can't identify them on the street sign, is that skill truly mastered? No, because that's the environment where we want them to be able to do that. So we need to think about where we want our kids to demonstrate these skills as well. And so there's some different things to consider. So what does mastery really look like? What is the timeline? What's the data? So everything we've been talking about, all of this is connected. So thinking about your goals and seeing mastery in goals, we kind of talked about this earlier as well. What do we do with 80%, 100%? Are we doing things across 3 consecutive days? Are we observing this 4 out of 5 times? And so knowing what the context of the goal is and what the area of the goal is will be helpful for you as well to think about, what does mastery look like for this goal? So a lot of behavioral goals will have in 4 out of 5 trials. So again, we have some of that wiggle room, but like Benita gave the example earlier, if it's, I think you said, Benita, like throwing items across the room, right? Like that's like, we really want that to be 100%, right? So taking everything into context. Go ahead, Benita.
And I was going to say 4 out of 5 trials is not appropriate for some behaviors. If I'm physically
Right.
aggressive, if I'm eloping, I'm fine with throwing stuff. I can't say 4 out of 5 because think about how long I've been exhibiting that problem behavior. So I want to make sure the criteria for mastery goes across days. And by that, I mean 20 days, right? Because if I can not throw something for 20 days, I probably am not going to be throwing something, right?
Right.
For a
Yeah,
while.
that's a really good point. So there's some difference between academic goals, what shows mastery in academic goals versus what shows mastery in behavior goals. So with a lot of academic goals, you'll see things like across 3 consecutive days, or like we had earlier, 3 consecutive probes or trials. And that's a good way to see versus saying like, oh, 80% of the time, because Benita and I were talking about this earlier, it can be misleading if we're using 80%, but the first 3 trials they needed prompting with. So yeah, maybe eventually after 10 trials or so you got to, or 15 trials, you got to 80%. But if the first few trials required full physical prompting, then
You
we're
did
not
not
getting to
know it.
mastery. Right.
You
We're
did
not
not
getting to
know it, which
mastery.
meant it had to be taught. So 80%
Right.
is skewed.
Yeah. And again, it doesn't mean that, you can never use anything below 100%, or you can never use 4 out of 5 trials, but really taking into consideration the context of the goal. Generalization probes should be included, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about generalization next, but within considering mastery, we want our kids to be able to, like the road sign, be able to take that skill out of the classroom and into the community and into real life, not just something that's practiced in the classroom and then they've mastered it. We want to make sure it's generalized across settings, across people, that children don't become reliant on they will only do something with one person, because if they only learn to look 2 times if we're crossing the street with their RBT, and you're out on the street with them and they don't look both times because RBT isn't there, then that skill is not generalized. So we want this skill to be able to be demonstrated across the board. So generalization is really important in ABA, to the extent of which the concept of generalizing a skill is considered one of the 7 dimensions of ABA. So it is one of the foundations to the work that we do. So generalization is what I just talked about, when a behavior or goal occurs outside the environment or with different people and at different times. And that is true mastery, not just being able to do something and demonstrate it with one person in one setting, but being able to spread it across. Something that I included in here is that programs should be designed explicitly for generalization. It doesn't just come free with teaching a goal. We have to specifically talk about generalizing skills, because otherwise it's not going to happen. And so there's multiple types of generalization, but there's 3 I really wanted you to know about. And one is response maintenance. One is the behavior continues after the intervention has been removed. So if you've heard of like a token economy or a token board, if to do homework, let's say, for example, if your child then does homework without relying on that token board or token economy, then that means that your child is in response maintenance. They're not relying on a type of intervention or reinforcer to come from the outside, that they are able to maintain it on their own. Setting generalization means that the behavior occurs in more than one setting than where it was taught. And stimulus generalization is when different but physically similar stimuli evoke the same response, or when the conditions change. So the example here is toilet training, and you can tell I'm a parent of a 4-year-old because I use the word potty. Bridget learned to use the potty at home, but then went to school with a different toilet and then also used that toilet at school. So different stimuli, but similar, and continue to show that generalization. So when we're talking about toilet training, if your child is only using one toilet in one setting, that has not been generalized. And then some more resources, strategies for promoting generalization. Teaching the skill in a variety of settings is really important, which I know can be really difficult sometimes if your kid's in school a lot, but trials, running it repeatedly, repetition, and in more than one place is really crucial. Involving other people, making sure it's not just one person doing it. And this is where BCBA is training a whole team is really important, because the teacher, RBT, the speech therapist, the physical therapist, the OT should be really supporting some of these programs across the board. And then plans for generalization, another good thing to bring with you to IEP meetings and when you're talking about SDIs, generalization plans should include all of these things: the baseline data, reinforcement strategies, plan how you're going to plan to respond to challenging behaviors. They're all really important to take into consideration when thinking about generalization, because again, it doesn't come for free. It doesn't just happen. It has to be planned for. And specifically talking about SDIs, or specially designed instructions, generalization is really important within SDIs as well. SDIs directly address child's goals. They can be used to address needs across the board. So generalization, because these goals are across the board, generalization should also include things across the board: the setting, including home, community, all of those things. SDIs should show how these goals are going to get generalized. And then I have some resources here as well for looking more into generalization and how to help determine that mastery goal criteria as well in IEP meetings. And so if you have any IEP meetings coming up soon, I definitely recommend looking at the intentional IEP, the autism helper. These are really great resources to help prepare you before you go into these meetings, to look at what should you be looking for in these goals to make sure that your child is completing them, not just while they're sitting in that classroom or in that training center, but are they doing them at home, and are they doing them in the community as well? And that is all I have.
So we got time for some questions,
Yes, we do.
guys.
I want to make sure to leave some time for questions.
And I hope you all got your questions coming. I did try to fill in the blanks a little bit and give a little bit more information in the chat while Megan was talking. So I want everybody to know no question is dumb. Every question is a smart question. The only question that's dumb is the one that was never asked. Okay. Our goal is to make you armed and dangerous. We want you to go into your IEP meetings and we want you to be able to be on the same level, as the staff. We want you to be able to have that dialogue, right? As opposed to being like, oh yeah, sure. Okay. That kind of thing. So bring it on. What you got?
And something before we jump into questions, to speaking on that, I was very close with all of my kids when I worked at KEB, like all of the families, and because I had so many kids, I had IEPs and different needs like that. And for some kids, we're just getting them for the first time in 6th grade, unfortunately, because things went like unknown. I had a lot of parents saying, I don't know what this is. I don't know. I'm being really hard on themselves. I had to remind them, like, I had to go through a lot of schooling and training and education for this, because I've made the choice that I want to get into this field, and it required hours of dedication and learning. And it's a lot of work. As a parent coming into this, you didn't say, I'm going to go into this field. So don't beat yourself up. Use us, use these resources. And even if we don't have the answer straight away, like, I want Benita to share my contact information. Please feel free to reach out, because this is a lot.
Yeah. We're going to stop the recording here, going into the Q&A, right? And absolutely.